Welcome, everyone. I wanted to introduce you to the second time we're doing data dialogues. The whole point of data dialogues is to bring together leaders in the data space and talk about, we have a lot of podcasts with a single leader talking about one topic, but the whole idea is to bring in leaders and sort of really debate what are some of the most pressing topics inside the data space. So for episode 2, super excited to have Ahmed from Narrator and David from Delphi Labs just sort of joining us today. Ahmed, David, why don't you briefly introduce yourselves and let's take it from there.
Okay, I'm Ahmed. I'm the founder and CEO of Narrator, and Narrator is an end-to-end platform built on top of the activity schema. And the activity schema is a new way to model data that allows you to answer any question without having to worry about going back and preparing data every time you have a new question. David.
Thanks, Ahmed. I'm David, co-founder and CEO at Delphi Labs. So Delphi is an AI analytics platform that allows you to ask questions of data. We work with semantic layers and allow kind of safety and trust in the answers that non-technical stakeholders can get from us. And that's like our core part of our thesis, is that safety and trust. Both of us, having worked as data leaders before, know that trust in data is pretty much everything.
Awesome. Welcome, David. Welcome, Ahmed. One of the things I've been thinking about for a while is, just the current state of modeling, right? Like a few years ago, if you think about, where we were, data modeling, for the most part, was pretty embedded inside BI. You would have, an embedded data modeling layer and, sort of DBT sort of comes about. And, one of the big shifts is that data modeling is now a, completely separate layer, right? Independent of BI, it really becomes the gateway to data science, to reverse ETL. BI becomes just one of the consumers of it. So, that's really where we are. But we, would basically love to understand how is, Narrator and how is sort of Delphi, building on top of this modeling layer, and, where do you guys really see this is going towards?
Ahmed, do you want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, so when you look at, I think it's key to understand why data modeling had to leave the BI. And really it's constraint. When you have data modeling in your BI, every time you ask a new question that your BI tool can't really answer yet, you have to go back to the data model and re-prepare the data. And having a data modeling layer allows us to have one place where that logic lives, so you can change out your BI tool. The approach of Narrator is a little bit different, because what we found out was that data modeling is actually two pieces. And today we do it in one. The two pieces is that you're defining your business concepts and you're preparing the data to answer a specific question. And the challenge with data modeling right now is SQL is really good at representing business concepts because of its flexibility, but it kind of really sucks in preparing data, because every time a question is slightly different, you might have to redo your SQL, especially if you're relating things. And as people ask more behavioral questions, more relationships becomes critical, and therefore you have to prepare data a lot more often. So your modeling layer becomes a little bit of business definition spread out throughout the entire every model, and a whole lot of preparation definitions that is then delivered in such a limited format, which is column names. If you look at how many columns you have in your warehouse that say total sales, you'll understand what I mean by very limited explanation of the tables, that 50 tables all have total sales. Narrator shifts it on its head, and we say, let's define our data model in SQL. We call it the activity schema. We give you a standard data model, so you don't have to reinvent how to model data. We give you a way that we know works for Fortune 500 companies, startups, and every company in between, for every industry. And then we allow you to use a simple UI to combine that data to answer any questions. So we've innovated in the preparation step, allowing you to prepare data in 5 minutes. And I think this is going to be like the big shift in data modeling, giving it its own place, but also splitting the preparation, which is what we need to answer questions, from the business logic definitions. And I think that is the next iteration of what we see here, from removing it from BI tools and eventually splitting it so that anyone can ask any question really fast.
I get that. In some ways, it's quite a contrarian approach to what DBT is doing today, right? Which is a bunch of tools on like doing those two things which you mentioned. And I fully agree that two things, right? There's data prep and then there's the business application of it. And I get, at a high level that, very fundamentally data modeling implies that you have to know what are the questions you're trying to answer before. And that becomes very counterintuitive, because as soon as you have questions, you now have more questions. And if every time you have more questions, you have to remodel every time, I see why this becomes a huge obstacle. But, I fully, see the world not in like black and white, right? Like, I think like, there are hybrid solutions before the world really goes away, right? And DBT isn't, sort of going away overnight. So how do you, we have this better way of doing it. We have narrator and sort of David, I do want to come to you in a few minutes, but, how are we going to go from where we are today, which is, being able to like having to model upfront to eventually going to something like the activities sort of schema?
Great question. So I think it's again key to understand why things cascade. So let's break it down to two pieces too. So when you think about like building data models for an application, I would say there's two versions. I'm building data models for a production grade system, like my financial reporting. I'm building production data model for my executive dashboard. They're very specific tables that you need that need to have all these restraints. You want to put alerting on it. You want to put like version control on it. You want to have all these things that are super critical. You want to have a complex pipeline for anyone to touch it. Those things don't change that often. Those are what I call like, think about it, production systems. That's the same way as if you're a software engineer, you're building production systems. But then there's like the day-to-day things. I need to answer questions. I need to make a decision. I need to optimize something. Those require very different. The main thing here is speed and flexibility, not assurance of a single table. So I would see the world kind of shifting and splitting into more of these standard tables that are used for production grade, like financial reporting, and that will live in DBT and in that kind of star schema approach. And then you'll have a lot more of the flexibility done through an activity schema in asking and answering questions. You see this happening with like retool and like building, like you don't build production grade systems for your internal tools. Maybe you do if you have enough resources to, but most of the time you want to use something faster. You want to use Zapier. You want to use all these different tools that help you move faster. And I think even DBT themselves, if you read their article, when they talk about like how DBT didn't work for DBT and how they ended up having thousands of data models and it took over 24 hours to process their data. Well, like, how did that happen? They don't have 1,000 financial reports that they need to maintain. And how did this like thing scale out of proportion? Well, what happens is that you treated all the random questions, those ad hoc questions that somebody had out of their mind as a production system. And now you built stacks and stacks of things. 90% of that was for one-time questions, for specific questions. And like 7 or 20 of them were like mission critical, like business reporting things. And I think that we treat them the same. And when they're treated the same, like you either slack off and don't treat them all, or you treat all this junk with a high priority. And I think that's the fundamental shift that you're going to see is all these other things. And we see it with all our customers who migrate off DBT. They come in and they start off with like 1,000 tables and they slowly, I'm like, let's keep the mission critical ones and all these ones that are ad hoc, move it to narrator. Narrator is designed for ad hocness, for quickness, for speed. Build your dashboard, your executive dashboard in Looker, but build all the quick dashboards that somebody's asking in narrator because it's going to allow you to make changes and add and remove things really fast. And we see that migration where then they end up with a couple of really mission critical stuff in DBT and a whole lot, thousands and thousands of data sets in narrator answering questions that are just kind of disposable. I think that's the future what we're going to see.
Awesome. No, that makes a ton of sense. David, would love to get your thoughts on sort of Delphi and the current state of data. And then I would love to, explore some interplays between how does Delphi work in a future of the activity schema.
Yeah, so in some ways, Delphi's kind of ambivalent about your data model because we sit on top of a semantic layer. To date, it's usually one that a data team or an engineering team has created in like a semantic layer, like DBT or Cube or Looker or something like that. And so therefore, we're not as concerned about the shape of that schema. What we're concerned about is that the things that people want to ask about are mapped out and, far apart enough in terms of like vector similarity that we can map them to questions well. That's really how we operate. But it's really interesting because if you think about this data modeling problem, a lot of teams do try to use Kimball. And if you think about like the roots of that philosophy and whether it's Snowflake or Star Schema, it's rooted in these systems which are production systems, and they're not meant to change very often. You're meant to design in a waterfall way. This is everything that someone will want to know about this domain. Going to model it very heavily, and then do it once and change it not very often, really. That's what it's designed for. And I think that's part of the problem, is that people have kind of rigidly tried to use those. And I think that's part of the problem with that, is they've had the wrong people doing it as well. So like they said, oh, when we're going to build like a data warehouse, oh, let's get a DBA to come and design the data models. Like that's the wrong person probably to design that data model, because of the way they think and the way they've been trained. And I think what's worked better is when people are like Kimball-ish. It's like okay, I'm not going to design everything to the nth degree. And then they think about more flexible data models that, yes, there is some elements of, relations and knowing how to join between different things, but it's not so rigid that it makes development on it slow. And I think knowing that there's this gradient between this production system, and people should have those, right? When it's your financial data, when it's something that CXO use every week, that should be fairly well governed and fairly well understood and pretty slow moving in terms of change. But then like you've got the rest of it, which is very quickly drops off into this experimental pool. And that stuff does not need to be governed like that. That stuff does not need to be so inflexible. And I think that's a really like interesting point that Ahmed made, that why are we trying to apply the same kind of rigor there? It doesn't make any sense. It just slows us down.
Yeah.
It's one off. Why should we do that? And I think part of the problem why DBT has made that difficult is because until recently, it's been very difficult to have multi-domains in DBT, right? Everyone's had some monorepo, or some people have tried to break the monorepo, and it's been very, very painful. And so then everything ends up in the same bucket, regardless of whether it's some experimental one-off thing or whether it's the thing that goes in front of the CXO every week. And that's been a problem. Whereas I think that's more or less solved now, whether that's through the feature DBT are going to release, whether you can use DAGs or something like that to help you do multi-repo. That now allows you to have those different domains, some of which can move very fast, some of which can't and must have different rigor applied.
Yeah. And, I know that you guys focus on the semantic layer, but in sort of activity schema, would you be able to go sort of generate the semantic layer on top? Essentially what I'm getting at is, we have a whole ecosystem post the modeling layer, right? We have this modeling layer. We now have tables as output. And now we have BI, which is a consumer of this. We have reverse ETL or data activation, which is a consumer. Analysts can basically go consume from these tables. In the narrator world, you basically are doing this now in the application layer, right? Narrator is got a BI element to it. Narrator's got an analyze element to it. But we've built all of these toolings which go fundamentally work on top of raw tables. So, a sort of question to both of you, and I'm particularly interested in the, how are you going to generate semantic layer from this? Is this going to be, who's going to own that? But then sort of pushing this back to Ahmed is in, how about all those 15, 20 other tools which we've built in these other categories which expect the world to look like a DBT-esque world? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so two pieces there. So one, let's talk about like the high level of like semantic layers in general. I think this is the key. I think that because like I have a tendency to believe, like I know that you mentioned that we solved this problem, but like if you look at Airflow, they did have domains and a way to split your system. Before that, Luigi used to have, which was Spotify's version, had it. Like we work when we had remodule, we had it. Like these things are ways, I think, to manage the problem. I don't think they come even close to solving the problem because you're still building more and more tables. And you look at further with Kimball, it was designed for a single data source. Like, if you read the Kimball book, there's nowhere where they describe the have to hack it join your front end data and your back end data that have no join key. Like that doesn't exist in the world when it was designed. If today you ask a single question, that like that's all the hard questions because you have embedded analytics. So like you don't really need to solve the problem of how to join your tables. Like a data analyst can do that in 2 seconds and SQL Copilot can do it in 10 seconds. Like you can do that easily. It's all the challenges come in when you're shoving data that doesn't really perfectly line up because they're separate data sources. So when you talk about the like semantic layer and combining that with everything in system, I think you do have to think about like what is semantic. And I think table is a shitty format for a semantic. Like tables are really hard to understand. I can give you a single table. I can tell me what this means. And if anyone can answer what this table means based on the column names, you're God. you need to look at the definitions behind it. And if you're hoping that someone wrote the definition in a documentation that is explicit enough to understand the nuance of it, like people convert from website to a lead. Is that like the first time they come to a website, or is it per session, or is it per like month, or is it like people might have multiple conversions? Is it deduping? Is it handling? What happens if we don't have, is it doing identity resolution inside of it? All these questions are the questions that data analysts will have to understand. So semantic layer needs to be representative of the world. That's kind of where the activity schema came to be, is that we talked about, instead of trying to build semantics around tables, let's build semantics around the actual actions that are happening to your customer. The same way that humans ask questions about, oh, I want to know when someone comes to a website and then buys. Those are the words that should be represented in your semantic layer. Your semantic layer should be so similar to the way that we ask questions, not the way data is represented. We've done this thing where we move data forward, not backwards. Sorry.
That makes sense. David, do you have any thoughts over there?
Yeah, but that's exactly what I see the purpose of a semantic layer for. The semantic layer is supposed to map real world things that people know about, you know, customers, revenue, orders, to database structures so that people don't have to care about those structures anymore. It's abstracted away. And that's exactly why we work with them, because, you know, we've tried some of the text to SQL tools out there. When you ask them to do 10 different joins at the same time and give you a good question, a good answer to a question, like it just isn't reliable enough for enterprise or for any business use. So that's why we think the semantic layer is important, to abstract away those joins and what the tables mean and things like that. I agree, it does require someone to actually know this is what this point of this table was and this is what this column means. And yeah, you do need to preserve that knowledge, but yeah, I guess your proposal for activity schema is that you don't need those people anymore. But yeah.
I have a question. What is the percentage of companies using semantic layer, right? And I want to look at it from two perspectives, right? Like from a perspective of really what we keep talking about, which is really what I call data and analytics for small medium companies, right? 100 to 500 person companies, under 5 people data teams. I think most of the conversation we in this space is sort of around these companies. And then there's this other tier, which is true enterprise, right, where it's not data team, it's data teams. It's not warehouse, it's warehouses. It's not one type of modeling, it's types of modeling. So looking at and I know we probably don't have the data for this, but what is penetration of the semantic layer in sort of today's world?
I think it's very low, in all honesty. There's not many companies using them. I think I'd say it's in the thousands. It's probably maybe tens of thousands at most. I doubt it's any more than that.
But, and when I think about true enterprise, right? Like, I think, true enterprise probably hasn't even gone into DBT as yet, right? They're still using Informatica and they're still using these tools, right? Like these are the biggest companies having these problems, right? So,
but that's where I think it changes, right? Because there might be few companies using them, but actually, if you think about the amount of data that's sat behind a semantic layer, I think that's disproportionately large. Because, like, so one of our partners, AtScale, who we've been working with, like they have some gigantic, like Fortune 500 companies who are using their semantic layer. And that's why I'm sure that the amount of data behind semantic layers is disproportionately large compared to the number of companies using them.
Amit, any thoughts over here?
Enterprise. I also think I don't know. I feel like enterprise is not even at that level yet. If you want to talk about enterprises, like when we talk to enterprise companies and work with the Fortune 500 companies, like I don't even think they even care about data modeling. Like they have questions that they need answers, and they're like, "How do I answer this question?" I remember talking to literally one of the biggest companies in the world, and they're like, "Oh, this dashboard is by week, and I need to see it by day because sometimes we launch in the middle of the week." Like the problems with enterprise is more on data access and data visibility, and like even getting that data manipulation skill set and uniqueness. Like it's quite hard when we work with 500 companies. We have to often sometimes spin up our own warehouse for them. It is a very different problem. They're not trying to ask a million questions. They're not trying to build more like executive like ability for people to self-serve. They're like really just trying to, they're still in like observation, like what the fuck is going on in my business and nuance. And I think that's just because their systems are so nested and on-prem and complex, and it's like you're trying to like, that's why they have to move to the cloud. Like it's a very different world there. I don't think they're even close to. I've never talked to. I don't talk to 400 companies, and they could give a shit about activity schema one bit.
And I
They
do
just
think
care about
change
getting
happens
answers.
exponentially, right? So I think that, although it's taken, a usual, sort of data infrastructure, it might have taken much, much longer. I think, we're going to see change very quickly. And, actually talking about change, sort of David, I've been very interested in sort of Delphi Labs. And really what I get from this is there's this new type of BI, which is going to be conversational BI. The idea of answering questions from dashboards and building reports is, again, very, very fundamentally, it requires knowing what the questions are beforehand and knowing what your metrics are beforehand and defining that. And every time you have a new metric, you got to you got to build a new dashboard. You have to enable this in a way. And, one of the things I love about what I'm not even sure if conversational BI is a real thing, or like I'm starting to use it, but I see this as a real threat to BI tools, BI companies, right? Like, why would I want a dashboard when I can ask any question and I can ask this on Slack, or I can, go speak to something like this? Do you believe that, what you guys, and I know it's not just you guys, but, a bunch of people and, even some BI tools, are thinking about this. But, is this a threat to, like, BI in the way which we know it today?
I think for certain use cases that would be true. Also, one thing I'd like to clarify is, while the penetration of like technology semantic layers is low, I think there is always a semantic layer. It just might be like up here. Like, I've been a semantic layer before, right, for people in the business to ask questions of. And that's what they wanted, right? And that's what I've seen my whole career, is that people just want to ask someone, oh, what's this thing? I need to know it, and I need an answer now. I don't need to wait weeks and make a JIRA ticket. And that's what people have always wanted whenever I've worked at different companies. So absolutely, that's what I'm betting on, is that people will just ask a question to get the answer they want. They don't need to go and, half the time, the dashboards that you see out there, those are just people's repositories of questions that they've already answered. Right? That's the way I think about them. And so if they don't need to store them because they can always just Google them, right? That's effectively what we're doing, right? We're making a Google for data analytics, right? Then you don't need to you don't need to store all of those tens of thousands of dashboards. You don't need to duplicate everything over and over again. You can just ask a question.
Yeah, but in that case, what is a license to Tableau, or what is a license to sort of really look like, right? Because you're paying a lot for those visualizations and for reports and for emailing and scheduling and, for self-service, which is, ability for people, whether it's Sigma to use Excel, whether it's ThoughtSpot mode, whatever it is, right? Like, that way, those set of tools built to answer questions in that format. If that changes, how does BI adapt to that?
So firstly, I think there's a continuum, right? It's not all going to disappear. There are standard reports that will always be wanted and needed, that's fine. And that's why you'll keep your BI tool. The thing that I think's happened that's gone wrong is that people have used the BI tool, and data teams have used the BI tool as their standard interface for anyone to access any data, right? And that's not been helpful. Like, so before we had reverse ETL tools, people would go to Tableau or something, download a CSV and stick that into Salesforce, right? That was the way people used to do that. And so I think, so what you find is that access to BI tools is massively inflated. Like, you have, 80% of a company with a BI tool seat, like, they just don't need that anymore. You'll have much smaller percentages of companies that actually have, the ability to go and explore and look and build a dashboard, because they just don't need that. But it will still be there. That's the way I see it. It's just for a narrower use case.
It makes a lot of sense to have a dashboard, right? It makes a lot of sense. I have an executive dashboard. I wake up, and I need to know XYZ. But the whole exploration part, that's what I'm questioning, right? Like, once I have this dashboard and I'm seeing this, but now when I want to go deeper, very fundamentally, wanting to go deeper might not have been modeled before, right? Like, however, conversational AI allows you to basically go sort of generate these, to basically go be able to club a bunch of queries together and be able to go deeper. So in some ways, minus the core dashboarding, which is building a simple dashboard, I get that. But what I question is the self-service capabilities of these tools, really in question?
Yeah, and I think they are lacking because a lot of them, if you think about the ideas like root cause, for example, they just don't have everything you need to do that. And like I don't know if any of you saw like Abhi's data council talk on metric trees. Like that's a concept that I've worked on like a couple of times in the past, and it's necessary in order for, because usually when someone wants to drill down from a dashboard task, because why did this thing happen? If they trust that the thing happened, then the next question is, why did it happen? And most of these BI tools don't have that as a concept, like this ability to drill down to the root cause. They allow you to kind of spin through permutations of dimensions, and then you start blaming things which actually may not even be the real problem.
Yeah, I've known Amit.
I think that's the key. Actually, wait, I want to add 2 tiny points on that.
Yeah.
I was going to say what you were going to say. Actually, sorry, I interrupted.
I was funny. I was just doing like, I've known Amit for a long time, and I can tell when he really wants to talk, and I could just like tell he was like bursting to talk. So
you guys said the 3 things that like you hit my bingo of like a perfect moment.
Triggers.
One is like, because I was the person who hated dashboards for, I don't know, so many years. I think dashboards are, just side note, are really great for inspiration. I think people need to be inspired to ask questions. I don't think people come in, like when we work with companies and we're like, give us a list of questions you have. It's not as many as you would expect, but you're like, how the hell is my backlog at 1 trillion questions? Because they look at something and they get inspired to ask the next question. The second part that you mentioned, which is like, both of you touched upon it, which is the idea that the follow-up question that you have is probably data that hasn't been modeled yet. And I think that's the key. And I think when Abhi talks about like the metrics layer, Abhi is like a big proponent of the activity schema, because being able to answer questions of like, based on things that like are not really clearly, like dimensions haven't been created, you have to kind of create the dimensions on the fly is what you're doing, is I think the key. I think that's that creating of dimensions on the fly, which is like, I want to see this by a very specific thing to see if that's driving it, or doing that analysis. I do think a lot of times starts with a dashboard. I do think it takes, I think you go down a kind of like a path of exploring the data. And a lot of times, like in talking to customers, like you will probably explore as much as you can with the tables available. Like Looker does allow you to slice and dice it until you get to the 3rd slice and you're like, oh wait, I don't have this feature here or this column here. I think that's the moment where like people, I don't think anyone wants to go submit a ticket to the data team. I think that's when they have to submit a ticket to the data team. That's when they're forced to go into the world and have to really ask their data team to answer those questions. And I think that's the problem that I think we really need to continue solving, is that how do you, because we do talk about this idea of a virtual analyst in Narrator, which is just like an OpenAI API on top of our activity schema structure. And it was built because we were like, okay, some questions are going to require data analysts, but our data modeling is relatively simple enough that we can actually have a layer where if I want to slice this by someone who did an action in the last 30 minutes, or I want to slice this by an attribute, those questions are really easy for Narrator to generate, even if they're never been modeled, because the activity schema makes that easy. And then when that happens, you do have the 3rd layer, which is that data analyst should be able to do it in 10 minutes. And then you get the answers, so you minimize that backlog. And then only in the very, very rare case, in like the 0.1%, do you actually need to add a new concept to your system. And I think that's kind of the chain that you're like setting up in a world of consuming information, is that there are checkpoints that people are going to self-serve as far as they can. But you need to make it, the self-serve not be because if you could slice and dice by every column and table, then I can run an AI, do every column generation and give it to you. And you can do that with Tableau, you can do that with Looker, you can do all these tools. It's these questions that are, like you said, that haven't been modeled yet, I think are where most of the time gets consumed.
And, I love this. And, one of, if you look at the layers of, data infrastructure, right? We have ingestion, very, very clear. It doesn't matter, you are going to need it, right? And you're going to need a lot more than the 200-300 available. There's a whole long tail of it. Makes perfect sense. Warehousing makes a lot of sense. Where and all of these I feel deserve to be individual categories. But I think BI, the sort of modeling piece potentially is now removed with activity schema. The modeling piece remains the same. But does BI and insights, like truly like action of like what to do about this, does that really start to get more merged? Because I think sort of conversational BI, starts taking away the exploring parts, which BI has done a good job. Is there a world where we start going into different verticals? And for the fintech vertical, you have a BI plus insights, because you start to understand actually some of the modeling challenges inside this world. Does this change for SaaS? Is this, do you see a world where, insight starts getting merged into BI? And, I know this is a tricky question for you, Ahmed, because, Narrator is modeling plus BI plus insights in some way.
But a lot of companies sit on top of us. Like this is what I call this operational analytics, which I think is going to be one of the biggest fields. And we have so many customers that use Narrator as their backend, and they're like kind of like a tool that their solution engineers use for delivering that. If your business is trying to deliver a like specific way to understand revenue, or a specific way to understand HR, or a specific way to understand construction, or a specific way to understand self-serve products that are product-led, free tier 2, freemium 2 things, there is a way to look at it, and experts can decide what analysis you need, what it should look like, how should you use it, and they will give you like, you'll start at like year 3 of your data analytics journey, because they'll give you everything already pre-thought out and pre-built. And I think that is going to be the future a lot, where people are going to start. I think people are going to start with these pre-built ones and expand.
Do you see more of, if you had to bet the future of Narrator, do you think Narrator is going to be more of a powered by Narrator tool, or Narrator is going to be last mile of sort of off data teams?
That's a really hard question. I think that, like, based on our current customer growth, I think it's going to be I think most users are going to start using Narrator as a powered by Narrator world. Like, I think that you're never going to start with I think the future of data is no one's starting from scratch. I don't think people are going to start from scratch. I think you're going to start from either a fully thought out implementation that was built for a specific industry. You might start off with what we call packages, which is a series of dashboards and analyses that you can use for your specific industry. But the problem is that gets you're starting. You're always going to ask questions that person never thought about. You're always going to want to ask more questions. And Narrator's flexibility is to add those layers and layers of questions. So I think you're always going to have this thing where people are selling, but through our Powered by Narrator offering, like expertise, which is what we do today with consulting and why you pay for big companies to do these analyses and thoughtful things. But you also want to take that and build upon it. And so far in this world, all these things, that's kind of my whole pet peeve in the world, is like, the more tools you have, the more things are independent, the more your consultants are doing stuff in Excel and Tableau, but then you have your own dashboard and Looker, and the more pieces you have of the puzzle, the more simple questions and building on top of other people's works gets really cloudy. Like, talk to a consultant, we talked to EY a lot, and they're like, yeah, we built this thing for them, but like no one can use it. Like, it's not like you're not gonna build on top of it. You're gonna take them as, that's it, input, output, they're done. As you get to more just operational analytics, everything will be able to be more will grow within the business.
Sure. And sort of, David, operational analytics makes a lot of sense. How do you, when you're thinking of world of powered by, where, even some of the insights which you guys focus on, being able to make semantic layer more accessible, what's the powered by version of this?
So some of the things that we've seen are like embedded analytics use cases where they have a standardized data model that doesn't really change, but they serve this data to their own customers. And you can think of very like big like companies that do this a lot, and they just want to provide like an AI interface on top. So we've been talking to some of those companies. Some of it's also like, how do you operationalize what you've then found? And for us, it's like, this is what we're looking at in our roadmap, is, okay, so once people trust us for what, they'll ask why. And then once they trust us for why, it's like, what next? And once you've got that, then the next natural thing is to make a recommendation about what they should do. And then once they do that, then it's the next step is to, well, here's a control lever to enact it, right? That's, I guess, the end goal of operational analytics, is that You start from an insight, end with an action, and done. And you just iterate and iterate, or perhaps even automate, so that the system's doing some of those things for you. And that's kind of the way I see it.
Yeah.
Got it. I do want to kind of go back to semantic layer for a second, because, what it really sounds like is, again, if we are moving away from the concept of generating tables as output, in some ways that's now being abstracted away, right? What do we do about, all of those other layers which we've built, which work on, what happens to reverse ETL? Like, reverse ETL exists as a category because it's not just about taking, data from your warehouse and pushing it back. They're building tools around understanding your audience, because your data isn't probably modeled best. And you're again adding business logic. You're basically making these, reverse ETL as a category. What I've been very interested in it. It's a category which is truly meant for business users, right? How do you add a business UI on top of your warehouse and now being able to push it to like other different layers? What happens to a category like that? What happens to governance? What happens to catalog? What happens to observability? And
see, for me, that's like exactly like one thing, a semantic layer. Like, and I don't mean the semantic layers we have today that don't have concepts like entities in, but if you think about what, in my mind, what a reverse ETL tool wants, a reverse ETL tool is always trying to pull an entity filtered by some attributes, enriched with some attributes, and then punt it onwards, right? That's what they're always trying to do. That you can see, like, was it High Touch released something to do identity resolution on the fly for you, right?
Yep.
That's because they're having to struggle with the fact that their customers are having to sit this on top of their tables, which are like poorly modeled, and then that's part of the problem. And I feel like you could abstract that away inside the semantic layer if the semantic layer supported entities.
I mean, I've always looked at identity sort of resolution as the core feature of product analytics as a category, right? Minus the, the dashboards on top of the, what this did wasn't like, that's what product analytics as a category sort of did. Do you guys?
It's impossible. Like the way that identity resolution works, as a person who's written many of them, like, you can't ever do quality identity resolution if you're just looking at product analytics. You're just never going to do it. You have to combine data, and like a narrator you're stitching when like someone, like, yeah, you have the basic ones when someone logs in, when someone is identified on the website, but also when someone clicks on a unique URL from your email and you have now that IP address in the same second and the same URL gets hit, then you can stitch. You get it when you redirect somebody from Calendly and now you have UTM parameters. The way that identity resolution works is you're always working on it. You're always adding layers as you get overlap between systems to combine and get the richest version of that customer. Like that is the key of how identity resolution has to work. And we used to demo this thing a lot when people would sign up. And before we had a website sign up flow, we would just you would never give us your email on the website, and I would show you your journey with your email attached to it. And just to prove to you that like the website identifies one piece of identity resolution. But I think the second thing you asked for is that this idea of removing tables. Tables are not removed. You still need tables. Like, I think the whole output of Narrator's dataset tool, whether you go take it into BI dashboarding or take it into analysis or take it into customer journey, you still are using that table, because that table is the way that data is moved in the history. So a lot of our customers who use Census or use High Touch, they do build this table of a customer and all these attributes that they're dynamically generating in Narrator and taking that data and syncing it to Customer IO to do their email sequencing. So you're always having that way of communicating.
But you're using tables as an intermediary format to basically then allow High Touch or to allow Census to do what it's saying. And I'm saying, again, this is something which I don't typically do, but I'm going full version. I normally always think that they're like 50 shades, in between. But at this point, like in a perfect world, then you even need it to eventually go into a table format, or just can it go from, your joint modeling application layer into wherever it needs to go inside the activity schema format?
I think David said it best, where like the number one most important thing that customers give a shit about is trust. Like, you need to give them a way for them to trust the data. And in data, trust is really hard to build and so fucking easy to lose. So like, if you're giving them, like when I started Narrator, the idea was activity schema, analyses, don't worry about the middle, we'll do it for you. And that didn't work. That company like was struggling because you give them an insight. They're like, well, how do I know this is correct? And you're like, okay, I need to help you break it down. Well, not just break it down. You need to be able to create it yourself because you need to be able to have transparency that you could have gotten the same conclusion. It's not just the answer. It's the how the answer came to be. It's every step, and every step you need to be able to understand it. If I give you a 1,000-line SQL query, that's not understanding it. That's just abstracting it away and being like, trust us. So you're seeing the rise of like that transparency layer throughout the funnel. When you think about Qubit's product analytics that competes with Amplitude, biggest thing, they'll show you the SQL they generate so you can see exactly what they're doing. When you're using Narrator, we think about like SQL as one way of presenting information, but also you need to be able to see the raw data and see the row make sense. You need to be able to right click on a row and see the storyline behind how that row came to be in a customer journey and see the external data that affect it. Because you're like, oh, how come these two dates don't make sense? Well, when you see that they submitted a ticket in between and all these weird things happened, you can build that intuition and trust in that row. Like that's one thing that we always say in Narrator. Every single piece of data you see in Narrator, you need to be able within 3 clicks, get to the exact journey that led that customer to that exact data point to happen. And that is a key aspect because that is how you build trust. And that is how people know where data is coming from. And if they can't do that and you abstract that too far away, then you end up getting like fun facts. And I think that's where AI becomes really tricky.
So, by the way, audience, if anyone has any questions, sorry, we've been carried away. I should have said this at the very start of the call. Please, I think we have some features around asking questions. Would love to hear from you, and I'll be able to bring these questions to Ahmed, the narrator. But while we wait for questions, one of the things which I wanted to ask you guys is, how does this work at like true, going back to like true large enterprise, right? Where it's not data team, it's data teams. Is there a world where, you have some teams, you have multiple warehouses, you have multiple data teams. How does this really work, in massive organizations like that?
I mean, from what I've seen, I've worked at like 1 or 2 companies that size. I think you treat those sub parts of the organization as their own company, and they have their own data team, and they operate that way. I think so many of these large companies have tried to have these giant projects where they unify all the data and the data teams all work together. And I have yet to hear of like a very successful one. I mean, Ahmed may have heard of one, but yeah, that's the way I see it.
Yeah, I also think, we spoke a lot about sort of redundancy, right? We spoke about redundancy in building models for everything. We spoke about redundancy in building dashboards. And, I think, we're onto the rise of like do more with less, right? The world, the way we knew it 12 to 18 months ago, I don't think that's ever going to happen. Again, in the future, I see, a platform like 5X and being able to go unify infrastructure. And I see Delphi Labs as, being able to move towards conversational AI and a lot of the intelligence and insights, sort of narrator being able to go do this. Are we entering a world where, we're going to see the rise of 1 to 5% data teams, which are able to do something which historically took 20, 30, 40, 50% data teams? And again, applied to massive organizations, the issue I've seen with massive organizations comes from like, as the organization grows bigger, you need exponentially more people to go do the same thing because you have a lot of redundancy and communication starts to sort of break. So if we're able to truly 5-6x smaller the size of a data teams because of everything we spoke about today, then it would make sense that even massive organizations could probably do it with data team, not data teams. But would love to guys.
Yeah, I agree with you like a lot, and with one tiny twist, because like if you look at all the recent customers who have you signed up for Narrator, it's always been a company that just fired half their data team, or like a company that's just like, that's like usually when you switch, because like it is like people feel like it's a big thing to switch to activity schema, but when you cut your team in half and you have to like do what you used to do and even do more with half, like activity schema is like, I think one of the only ways a Narrator makes that so quick and easy and cheap to do. The challenge I think with having one data team is like the way that we see it in large enterprises is every activity schema is core around the entity that you're trying to change. And the challenge is when you have big organizations, the entity you're trying to change is very different. We have people trying to change the idea of clicking on an ad, where they're like, their whole thing is serving ads and their ads are being impressed, ads are being bid on. But the same company might also have a team that's optimizing marketing, where the person they're trying to think is a cookie that they're trying to impact. Another person might be a full-on sales conversion, where their cookie is becoming an email, which is becoming a sale, which is becoming an opportunity, which is becoming a contract. And in narrative, those would be 3 separate streams. And that's how we like to think about it. So yes, you might have one tool to surpass them all, or they might have 3 different warehouses. But the challenge is like, they need to live in worlds where they're completely independent, because even the same word, like a conversion, might mean something for these teams very differently. And we try to really be explicit on giving them, minimizing the mental overhead of what is the data. Like the data should, like, I think the thing that you're hearing in the postmodern world is that data should become less of a thing you have to think about and more of what you're trying to answer. And if we get to the world where everyone's thinking about the question and what they're trying to answer, it's a better place. And all these little tiny things, like you might have a unified data warehouse with a separate activity stream per customer, per entity you care about, which each team has their own one that they care about. And that can be a separate instance or a shared instance or whatever it is. But I think that's the key that you need to kind of like think about, is the problem we're solving is not data modeling. The problem we're solving is not data simplicity. The problem we're solving is not data maintenance. The problem we're solving is that somebody has a question and needs an answer. And the less overhead that they can do to answer that, whether it's avoiding even thinking about the tables at all and going through natural language, whether it's thinking about the journey and preparing a data set and narrator, whatever it is that they need to do, we're all trying to solve that one problem. And you need to kind of keep that problem. That problem is very different based on the entity that everyone's trying to impact.
Yeah, and I think that almost sometimes means that when these companies have gone on these giant projects to unify all their data, normalize all the data, I think that's been a bad idea. Because why do you need to do that if the thing that you're trying to push is different in each? Some of these companies, their divisions don't even interact with each other. They just do something different within the same large group. So, you know, I think in some ways it's better for them to just operate independently, keeps their data model smaller, keeps everything simpler for everyone.
Yeah, but going back to, do you believe that, we're going to see, is it, do you believe that, 1 to 5% data teams, not for the massive organizations, but for, smaller organizations, do you think we're going to truly move to a world where we're going to see smaller data teams do a lot more?
But I think that's been the story for a while, right? Before the MDS era, right? You had the big data era, and I remember being at a company where they hired like 50 data engineers to look after their big data stack, right? And then as soon as like something like Snowflake and whatever comes along, and you have that stack, you're needing maybe 20% of those people to achieve the same results. And so we're always going to be chasing operating leverage. So I think, yeah, we should be moving towards.
I actually think it's going to go further. I think a lot of roles that we have today won't exist. Like, that is my bet on the world. My bet on the world, there's so many of these roles, and you're seeing that now with like the massive amount of higher.
Do you think won't exist?
Okay, so I'm going to give 2 roles that I think probably will not exist in 10 years, and I'm going to define what they are because they're very fuzzy. I think data engineering and analytics engineers will not exist in 5 years, and I bet a lot on that. And data engineering, not the people who are like, if you're dealing with large scale data and Spark and managing your cluster and doing like the EL because you can't use Fivetran, I think that's not the data engineer I'm talking about. Data engineer whose job is to like, whose input and output is, I take data and I try to make it more useful, but I don't actually have to use the data. Where there's really, like, I talked to a lot of executives who are like, I don't know what the ROI of that team is. I don't know how to even evaluate if they're successful, because the people consuming the tables that they give me hate them and they're not able to answer questions. And so data analysts are always like, don't have the data prepared so I can answer my questions. And therefore all this intermediary layers, kind of what we saw with, like you mentioned with Snowflake, removing the need to optimize warehouses, Fivetran, removing the need to EL yourself. I think this data prep step is going to be done by an analyst. It's going to be a lot smaller, but that's way smaller. And then a tool, like, because that's what Narrator allows. And you're going to be shifting on answering questions, like embedded analysts, lots of analysts, focus on the analysts who are going to be answering questions and preparing data. And even like the machine learning with tools like, what is it called? Happy Face or whatever, Smile Happy, or I can't remember their name. But there's a lot of tools now that, what?
Hugging Face?
Hugging Face. I was like, what is it called? But tools like Hugging Face and OpenAI and all these other tools are going to enable you to allow a data analyst to just kind of like deploy the machine learning, do the data prep themselves, get the question, deploy the machine learning. And we see that with a lot of, like I mentioned, like most of the times when companies, and this is like very biased because I am talking to executives who fired like 10 analytics engineers and they're like, this approach was terrible. And now I have 3 analysts that have to suffice, and they're the happiest they've ever been with a tool like Narrator, able to deliver and allowing the analyst to answer all these questions. Like it is the world that I would like to see. And I think it's going to happen.
I want to go into 2 questions which we've been asked. We have Brandon who asked, data is very personal to organizations, and yet the cloud ERPs are expected to deliver analytics to the customer base. Should organizations expect to get a good solution from the ERP, or should the assumption always be to partner with a data company or a more personalized data solution provider? I think in general, like, expecting an ERP is going to give you a great data and analytics solution. I think data and analytics is like a layer on top of ERP, which probably most of them don't do a great job with. And I think you're always going to have, like, the world in general is moving towards small niche providers doing a much better job, and end-to-end platforms in general, don't end up, they have a one size fits all, and that's not very often the best answer.
I mean, those ERP providers have had decades, right, to do a good job of this, and they haven't. I don't see why you'd bet on them suddenly picking it up and doing it well. I wouldn't bet on it.
Yeah.
If they did do a job, do you think we would even have this sort of data ecosystem, or do you think?
Well, hold on. I think we're missing 2 questions here, because I think in the beginning, I would say use the ERP. Like building a data system is not like easy and just like shove everything start. Like I think like a company like Shopify, if you're trying to measure like your P&L and or you're trying to measure your orders and stuff like that, your ERP.
Yeah, but I think Shopify is a bad example, right? Because it's very, very just in the e-commerce, everything works there. For a lot of companies in e-commerce, Shopify would be great. And we're like, let's go into like SAP, let's go into like.
That's what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So and when you dive into that, I'm saying, like, I don't know if you've ever tried to replicate like SAP's like report logic that someone's trying to use in a warehouse. Like it is not a trivial thing to do. It is incredibly complicated. And I think the thing I'm trying to say is, like, they do different purposes. Like an embedded analytics is trying to help you understand the analytics inside that tool. The moment, if you're trying to understand the analytics of the tool, I would start with embedded analytics and build your way up to a warehouse. If you're trying to understand how that impacts another system, you have to go into a data warehouse. You have to start building your data, answering questions. That is the key. And this is kind of this is such an important distinction, because I do think that it is weird to me that we build data warehouses designed to replicate embedded analytics. Data warehouses are designed for cross-warehouse relational things that don't really exist. It's when you need to go to the warehouse.
Yeah.
And that is the key. So it's that moment where you transition and you kind of grow out of embedded analytics.
I think you said something really interesting, and I fully agree with that. Like, having an ERP or a CRM, any of these tools, and taking data from external data sources and trying to push it into your ERP or into your CRM, that's where things get really crazy, right? They're just not, go do this. That's when you want to do anything cross-system, go pull it into the warehouse and do it there. We have one last question. In your experience, how have you handled customers who seem to have different definitions for the same set of metrics? I'm guessing for onboarding on platform like Narrator Delphi, this would be the most fundamental thing to do. Is this something which you have to do, or can you have different definitions of metrics? I know at WeWork we had 5 different definitions of sales.
Exactly. So let's take that exact point, and then I'll let you go, David. Sorry, I'm going to jump in first, because that exact point at WeWork is one of the reasons why Narrator exists. The reason why I have 5 different definitions of total sales is because everybody cares about a different definition of total sales. For the billing team, it's when the first payment is made. For the global team is when like somebody reserves a contract. For the sales team, they get paid out when the contract is signed. For the, like, everyone has different meaning of it. And the thing that Narrator does that it makes it really, really avoid, because we're not a metrics layer, we actually say, like, I actually strongly think metrics layers are terrible because of this exact problem. I say, never define total sales as a metric. That is like a terrible way, and it's a really good way to spend all your time debugging. But define the activities like signed contract, started a subscription, made payment, sent invoice. And based on the team, what you're actually asking is based on this activity, summing up the revenue related to that activity. And that is what total sales really means. So based on the person asking the question, you should deliver them what they need. And like, if you were using our LLM and you say, give me total sales, say like, which activity are you referring to? Are you referring to when someone signs a contract or when someone does it? And based on the activity, the query should be generated and like, okay, I actually care about people who have signed a contract. And that's what I mean by total sales. Total sales itself and that metric will never be defined nuanced enough to give you that representation of what you're actually trying to get. So I think fundamentally that design is flawed. You should focus on the activity and summing it up.
David, what are your thoughts? And how does, how would Delphi be able to go do this?
Yeah, so we've seen this already with some of the people using us. And what they've typically done to get around it just for now is what they've just written a description for like, because they will have like revenue and revenue 2 or something. And obviously Delphi struggles between revenue and revenue 2, which one's important. And so they just write a label or a description saying, this is the definition as per sales, this definition, or this is the definition as per marketing's definitions, and this is what it means. And then because we have that extra information, we can then choose the right one when someone asks the question. But I think there are better ways that I've seen in like that some semantic layers have adopted. And like revenue is like the typical one where there's 17 different versions in a single company. And you can have these concepts like it's almost like you have a parent metric, for example, and underneath it you have all of these variants of the metric that can be called. So maybe you don't define the metric once. You define this is the type of metric and it's this and it has these attributes, and then you can filter these combination of attributes or use the attributes in tandem to define a new variant of that type of metric. So I've seen some semantic languages do that. I think that's probably the best way. And most of the time in my career when I've seen this problem, it's just because there's some filter applied to this metric, and that's what makes it different to someone else's version of it.
Awesome. Guys, I know we are just out of time and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So, big thank you to David and Ahmed for joining us today. This was really a fun conversation, and big thank you to our audience for being over here. We are going to be doing this on a monthly basis. We are going to announce our next episode. We have Ethan from Portable and we have Ben, known as the Seattle data guy, joining us for our next episode. I think we're just finalizing the topic. So again, big thank you, Ahmed and David, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.